Okay, welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone today on a somewhat of a muggy Thursday, a little bit after 12 noon. My name is Sandy Keaty. I'm one of Heritage Toronto's board members. I'd like to first of all provide a land acknowledgement today. Heritage Toronto is located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe, including the Chippewa and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, Toronto is host to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Toronto is within the territory of the Dish, with One Spoon Treaty, which requires responsibility of those who use the land to share it peaceably and care for it. Heritage Toronto acknowledges this responsibility and recognizes the efforts of these nations in maintaining the land. Founded in 1949, we acknowledge that Heritage Toronto has contributed to the colonial historical narrative. We are working to amend that by engaging with Indigenous communities to incorporate many of their stories into our programming. Plaques with colonial language are being revised. Indigenous content is being integrated into our walking tours, and in the future, we hope to expand our Indigenous programming. Heritage Toronto is a charity and an agency of the City of Toronto that celebrates our city's rich heritage and the diverse stories of its people, places, and events. Through our programs, including tours, plaques, State of Heritage Report, our online exhibits, we engage the public to reflect on the past, both to make sense of our present and to inform our future. Today, I'd like to thank our 2021 presenting sponsor, TD, as well as our tour sponsor, Andrew and Sharon Himmel and the Himmel family. Without their support, these tours would not be possible. So just as a little reminder, if you have any questions during the tour, please enter them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll answer them at the end of this tour. Now I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our tour leader. Our presenter today, Steven Kellier, is Heritage Toronto's Public Programs Coordinator and the creator of the Peddling the Parks tour. Stephen recently received a Master of Arts from the University of Leicester's School of Museum Studies and has contributed to public programs at Toronto's Bata Shoe Museum, Black Creek Pioneer Village, and Heritage Park Historical Village in Calgary. So right now I'm going to hand off the tour to our leader, and I hope that everyone enjoys.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sandy. I'm very excited to be hosting you on this exploration of Toronto's waterfront today. And I'll just share my screen here. All right, so Peddling the Parks, of course, is a cycling tour that I developed, and we're going to explore the history of Toronto's waterfront. And today we were able to explore it from the comfort of our own home, which is fantastic. But of course, you're welcome at another time to join us in person. I know we have 2 tours in September that I'm looking forward to. And what's fantastic today is, of course, the Martin Goodman Trail extends all across the waterfront, so it's fantastic for biking. And I don't know about you, but for me, day to day, I don't really think about the lake all that often. I mean, think maybe yourself and reflect on the last time you were at the lakefront and what you were doing. Were you able to enjoy one of the lakefront parks? You know, I'm all the way up in East York, and I forget that we're right next to this really important and immense body of water that has really shaped Toronto in many different ways, and Torontonians as well. And so I've been very excited to discover those stories when putting this tour together. So we're going to start our tour all the way in the west, sort of south of Parkdale, in a park called Marilyn Bell Park. And we're really going east all the way to the Portlands and then up to Tommy Thompson Park. And so, of course, we're starting at Marilyn Bell. And what's fantastic about the location of Marilyn Bell in the West is it ties to sort of that pre-Toronto history really well. So not far from Marilyn Bell, on the CNE grounds, just to the east, was the site of the former Fort Rouillé. And Rouillé was actually a French fur trading fort that operated from 1749 to 1759. And the French were trading largely with the Mississauga people. And that trade network, and this area was very important to a trade network called the Carrying Place Trail. Starting in, you could go through Lake Ontario, up through the Humber River to Lake Simcoe, and then out to Lake Huron and beyond. And the importance of that trade route to different First Nations is evident. You can go back as far as the 15th century, and I'm sure earlier, but to sites such as the Parsons site in North York, sort of near where the Humber River and Black Creek meet. That is a former Wendat village that archaeologists have uncovered, and has these huge, rich, artifacts that have been discovered that show trade, really extensive trade and goods coming in from all over. So different groups have been present along the Carrying Place Trail, including the Mississauga. Rouillé itself, the fort, wasn't a terribly large fort. I don't think it had a garrison of more than 15. It had sleeping quarters, a kitchen, a place to store supplies, but in 1759, it was burned down by the French. This was during the 7 Years' War with Great Britain. And of course, the French didn't want the British to take control of the fort. So it burned down. And New France, at the conclusion of the war, passed to British control. In 1792, the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Gray Simcoe, arrived in the Toronto area. And he really valued this natural harbor because he saw it as very defensible. And you can sort of see this in this map. This is by Joseph Boucher from 1815, but it's a copy of a much earlier map that was done in the 1790s. And you can see that large marsh to the east, which we're going to talk about later, called Ashbridges Bay Marsh. Later called Ashbridges Bay Marsh. You have the sandbars that curve along, of course, attached to the Toronto Islands until the 1850s. So you really have a relatively narrow entry into the harbor. So it's naturally more defensible. It's also further away from the border with the United States than other harbors like Newark, or now Niagara-on-the-Lake, or Kingston. And of course, Simcoe himself had a lot of worries of aggression from the United States. He had fought in the Revolutionary War in Pennsylvania and New York and Massachusetts as well. And there was this real worry of aggression coming from the South. One sort of interesting aspect of this map is, again, it's really focused on the natural features and the defense of the harbor. That grid of the town of York you see above, there's nothing accurate about it. It's just sort of yes, this is roughly where a town could be. The focus is on the natural features around. Now, Simcoe's sort of vision for a really well-fortified naval base never really came about. And maybe ironically, in 1813, during the War of 1812, the waterways sort of brought a threat, right? They brought a force of Americans, first spotted in the east by the Scarborough Bluffs in April of 1813, and they actually made their way around and landed to the south of where Parkdale is, so really close to where Marilyn Bell Park is today. And eventually they were victorious and sacked the town of York. So it's, to me, quite interesting that in this site really ties into those bigger stories, early Toronto trade, diplomacy, military. But I also really like to touch on those more individual stories. And of course, if we fast forward far into the future, and we'll be jumping around history a bit today, to the 1950s, we can talk, of course, about the person that Marilyn Bell Park is named after. Marilyn Bell was a very accomplished young athlete. In 1954, she, along with a number of much more sort of seasoned and older swimmers, she set out from Youngstown in New York and started her 40-mile swim across Lake Ontario. Despite being with all of those seasoned swimmers, she was the only one who was able to complete the swim. It was a cool September day. Imagine those rough Lake Ontario waters. I mean, I get tired doing a few laps, in a swimming pool. But she went through the lake swimming for 20 hours and 59 minutes, if you can imagine that. So that huge physical feat that she accomplished. She is, I believe, the first person we know of anyway to swim across Lake Ontario, and became very much a local celebrity. And only a year later, in 1955, when this image was taken to the left, Bell completed a swim across the English Channel. And what a fantastic image that you can see her after, again, another long swim, I'm sure completely exhausted, slowly inching her way through shore. She has to, I believe, do it herself, can't be assisted until she makes land fully. You can actually see the gentleman in the black jacket to the right is Gus Ryder, her coach, who actually, of course, trained Bell and followed her along in her swim by boat. And he would give her cups attached to a stick with water and corn syrup to give her nourishment to be able to complete her swim. And on finishing that, she became an even greater celebrity. The Premier of Ontario, Leslie Frost, congratulated her personally sent her congratulations from all of the people of Ontario. And when she returned to Toronto, parades were held in her honor. And so she was present at Marilyn Bell Park when the park was open and a plaque unveiled in her honor in the 1980s. And I think what a fantastic way of someone's life sort of shaped by Lake Ontario. So we see all of those different relationships. We're actually going to continue east now to Ontario Place. And Ontario Place, we're really focusing on leisure and entertainment and public access to the waterfront. And that theme of use and access to the waterfront is going to come up sort of throughout this tour. I think it's one of the more important aspects of the story and our relationship with the lake as a city. And so one thing about Ontario Place, and you can see it in the images at the left, is it's actually being built up on man-made islands. And you're actually going to see man-made land across the waterfront. In fact, I believe every spot along this tour is on man-made land. I think a lot of us might be familiar with the fact that Front Street, which runs by Union Station, used to be on the waterfront, and how far away it is from today's actual lakefront. So it shows the massive development that we've done. And when the Ontario Place was completed, it really was a vision of the future. And that was the goal of its architect, Eberhard Zeidler. Zeidler was a German immigrant who'd studied at the Bauhaus School in Weimar and really had a sort of forward-thinking view of architecture. He was known for also creating, designing Sick Kids Hospital and the Eaton Center, among other spaces. And I mean, this almost space-age looking space with steel and glass pods attached to that big central dome called the Synosphere. I mean, I think would have looked like something very out of this world. It was inspired by sort of those great works that had been done for national exhibitions like the Chicago World's Fair, or even more important, the Expo 67 in Montreal. And especially the Synosphere, which at night, if you can imagine, all of the hundreds of white lights attached to it, would light up, and it was described just as sort of this sparkling fantasy. And inside it, it was the first IMAX theater, a 6-story screen that sat about 1,000 people. And I know Zeidler really felt that when people went into the Synosphere and enjoyed a movie, they'd feel like they were floating in space. So what a really advanced and remarkable and accessible experience for people. When Ontario Place opened in 1971, it was about 50 cents for admission. And it was a place for fun and education as well, as there were a number of exhibits in the pods. Of course, you had the Forum, the musical venue at Ontario Place. Here you're seeing a guest conductor with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. And of course, it was an amphitheater that I guess people could sit all around. You can see the audience that are actually up into the hills that surround it, enjoying the performance. There were all types of performances that were done there, both symphony orchestra, ballet, dog shows during the day, real legends like in the 1970s, Sarah Vaughan or Roy Orbison. You have Canadian icons like Blue Rodeo or the Rankin family, all performing in this really wonderful venue. And there's Children's Adventureland as well, which I love the descriptions of sort of the early adventures you could enjoy there. One was, I think, called the Foam Marsh or Foam Bog or something like that. Foam Swamp, that's it. And it's, of course, just pieces of foam covered in blue tarp that children would have to navigate. There were all these sort of adventurous activities that you could enjoy. And they got more and more sort of, I would say, intricate as Ontario Place operated, right? You had a huge roller skating rink in the early years, which I think would have been a blast. You had, I believe, one of the first water slides in Canada put in the late 70s. You had bumper boats, gondolas, water cannons. I mean, all of these different forms of entertainment that made Ontario Place, I think, really special and definitely a source of nostalgia for lots of Torontonians still today. In 2012, due to declining attendance, it was closed by the Ontario government. And there's been a lot of, I think, maybe anxiety and apprehension around what the future of the site would be, especially it staying publicly accessible. What's the future of the futuristic Synosphere and pods would be. And so as we make our way really not far, just to that right edge of Ontario Place to Trillium Park, which was first announced, I believe, in 2014, there's sort of some, I think, a glimmer of hope in this park for what would become of Ontario Place. I should mention before we leave Ontario Place fully that in 2019, it was added to the city's heritage register, the Synosphere and pods. In 2020, the World Monuments Fund added it to its list of cultural heritage sites at risk. And very recently, the government's come out with a plan in the next few years for Ontario Place. I won't get into it much right now, but I definitely encourage you to sort of look into it. I think it's an interesting story and definitely an ongoing conversation. But when we get to Trillium Park, what I really love about this site is in a lot of ways, although it's very different, I think it preserved the sort of spirit of Ontario Place quite well, that spirit of celebrating Ontario, of education and of access. The park itself is made to look, although it's relatively recent that it's opened, it's made to look like a well-established wilderness. They brought in over 28,000 shrubs, I believe, and thousands of already matured trees to sort of celebrate Ontario's natural history. It was also created in consultation with the community, including several Indigenous groups, and they really wanted to show and celebrate the relationship of different First Nations with the Ontario landscape. And that's done in a number of ways at Trillium Park. But I think a great one that really stands out is these Moccasins Engravings near the entrance. They're part of a larger moccasin identifier project that was started by the former elected chief of the Mississauga of the Credit, Carolyn King. And it's a way of, through going into schools or events or other public venues, having people stencil moccasins, creating these identifiers, a good entry point to discuss Indigenous history and culture. Interestingly, the moccasins that aren't just of Mississauga, but other groups such as the Cree, are based on centuries-old moccasins housed and preserved in the Bata Shoe Museum. So there's a lot of detail that went into these designs. What's interesting both about Ontario Place and Trillium Park is they really tie into this larger history of waterfront amusement. Two examples that I'll talk about. One is Sunnyside Amusement Park, which sort of reached its heyday in the 1920s. I mean, you can see the crowds here enjoying carnival rides, a big dance hall, a bathing pavilion, restaurants. There's also this massive promenade, and you can see the people on the right in the early 30s, you know, dressed in their fine clothes. I think the fashion is just wonderful that you see in this image, and could stroll and sort of show off their best. So all of this real important destination for fun and enjoyment. And I know the bathing pavilion still stands today. And then you also, of course, have the Toronto Islands. And I think you could do a full tour on the history of the Toronto Islands. So I'll be quite brief here, but suffice to say, since very early on, that the islands have been a destination for sort of an escape from the city, for enjoying nature, for fun and relaxation. I mentioned before, becoming islands after the 1850s, when that sandbar was erased and they were no longer attached to the mainland. And this buildup, including a hotel opened by the famous rower Ned Hanlon in the 1880s, moving into, I think, its heyday again, sort of the early 1900s into the 1920s. I mean, these images are fantastic. I love the one on the left with this amazing race going on, despite, you know, just the still wearing sort of that restrictive Edwardian garments. And to the right, of course, the image of people on the ferry to Toronto Island. What I love about it is I think it's still quite relatable to a trip today, where you're probably trying to keep your young ones occupied and they're fiddling around and you're eager to get to your destination. Although, again, I think the fashion has changed quite a bit, of course. But really, I think both sort of relatable images. And so moving along to Coronation Park, what I find fascinating about this space is, again, that story of access, but in a very different way from Ontario Place, serving sort of a number of important needs, including right now, I mean, you know, that importance of a very large grassy green space in downtown Toronto in a very dense area. I know during the ongoing pandemic, right, that ability to have a space to roll out a towel, read a book, relax, have the breeze coming off the lake, and enjoy sort of a breath of fresh air. Originally, I think one of the first needs the park served was providing employment. And it was actually, again, all of it is on man-made or person-made land, developed in the 1930s as a way to give some security and work to people struggling through the economic disaster that was the Great Depression, when about 30% of Canada's workforce was unemployed. And through creating this work, at least temporarily giving people a bit of relief and purpose. Now, there's a lot of symbolism tied to Coronation Park. Of course, coronation means celebrating the coronation of King George VI in 1937. And you can see that right in the center circle here, the Empire Circle it's called, where you have an oak tree at the center with the name King George VI on a plaque nearby. Oak representing the monarchy, its deep roots connected to sort of that long-standing tradition, that old institution. And then the trees surrounding it each have a plaque that represent a different part of the empire. So you have a tree with a plaque that says India or Australia or Canada. But the bulk of the park is really a memorial to those who'd served and died, who were part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force during the First World War. And you can see the different areas sectioned off into different divisions who served during the First World War, and then each tree had a plaque with the different unit that it was associated with. And so I know in 1938, when the plaques were dedicated, thousands of veterans participated, and that those trees really were an important place for memorial, where members could gather of a unit by the tree. They might lay a wreath, play a bugle, offer salutes to their fallen friends and comrades. I think interestingly, despite sort of the importance of this site and the symbolic value of it, twice it was threatened with demolition. One in the late 40s, early 50s, when they were planning the Gardiner Expressway. They were actually going to have the Gardiner go directly over top where Fort York now sits, and they were going to just pick up Fort York and move it to Coronation Park. And of course, yay, local historical groups rallied against that, and that was prevented. And then in the 1970s, there were plans to expand the C&E grounds and build an amusement park on the site of Coronation Park. And that was opposed by local veterans groups. So the park both times were preserved, which really shows, I think, the power of citizens groups to really shape the waterfront. And that probably continues today in campaigns, including those around Ontario Place that are ongoing. So in this image, you can see actually George VI and Elizabeth on their royal visit in 1939. Here they're visiting a hospital, and as part of their visit, they also did preside over the official opening of Coronation Park. And then to the left, one group I want to quickly touch on, which has a fantastic name, is the Society of the Men of the Trees. Now this group, and that's an image of the Toronto chapter, but this group was international. It was actually started by an Englishman named Richard St. Bob Baker. I always want to say Barker because the price is right, but definitely Baker. And he was a forestry officer, an Englishman who was actually one of the first graduates from the University of Saskatchewan. But he was serving in Kenya and worked with the Kikuyu people to promote reforestry and tree planting. He had been himself passionate about trees his entire life. And when he returned to England, he worked to set up a chapter of the Men of the Trees there, and it spread sort of in the 1920s. And I want to emphasize that although it was the Men of the Trees, members were both men and women. And in Ontario, we're really involved with efforts to campaign against clear cutting in Northern Ontario, to preserve green spaces in Toronto, which was rapidly developing, to even campaigning against the cutting down, going into the forest and cutting down Christmas trees at Christmas time, and the impact that that was having. And so this group had a number of veterans that were among the members who also served on the planning committee of Coronation Park. And they were maybe a bit optimistic, very idealistic, but had this view that if people could dedicate their time internationally to reforestation, and we could address scarcity and environmental damage, sort of, it would lead to greater sort of peace and harmony. And so by tying in tree planting, to this memorial, it's sort of tying in that anti-war sentiment maybe a bit with forestry. So again, we see very different relationship with the waterfront at Coronation Park. And then as we move on, we're going to actually talk about two stories and two parks, both Little Norway Park and Ireland Park, which I think both tell a very similar story, the movement of people and the use of the waterfront as a bit of a refuge. Little Norway Park's that big green space that is at the entrance to Billy Bishop Airport. And then Ireland Park, it's relatively small. It's right on the end of what you see Bathurst Quay there, that little strip that curls around the large cement Canadian malting silos that still stand there. And I'll very briefly, because they are sort of that giant concrete elephant in the room when you talk about Ireland Park, are the Canada malting silos that were set up to receive grain from the waterways, grain that could be converted to malt and then shipped out using the railways to different breweries. And so those still stand today. So while we have the movement of goods, but we're sort of focusing on the movement of people. And Ireland Park commemorates the movement of Irish refugees coming from Ireland during the Great Potato Famine, starting in the late 1840s. And those who emigrated from Ireland already worn out and exhausted from terrible conditions in their homeland, took what were known as coffin ships, because of course those ships had such terrible unsanitary conditions. Disease was rampant, especially typhus, which was a big fear at that time. Arrivals would make their way down through the St. Lawrence into the Isle of Gros Isle, just outside of Quebec City. Where they would be examined, and those showing signs of illness would be quarantined. Those who were fit to go continued into more inland ports, including in Toronto. In Toronto, they all had to pass through a wharf that is no longer around, but was near Ireland Park, called Reese's Wharf, where again, they would be inspected. Those who showed signs of illness were put into quarantine sheds, first by the wharf itself, and then moved to sheds at the General Hospital at John and King Streets. They did not, I wouldn't say, receive a warm welcome. One first-hand account from the time said how they were sort of herded out of the ship like cattle. And there was a lot of fear surrounding this influx of disease. I think it was something like 38,000 people passed through the port of Toronto, refugees from Ireland, not all staying in Toronto, many passing on through to other parts of North America, at a time when Toronto's population was probably around 20,000. So you're seeing, imagine that volume of people today versus the size of where you lived. These statues that are part of Ireland Park were designed by sculptor Rowan Gillespie. They really express the wear and tear and suffering of these people. There are 5 statues, you can see 4 here, but there are 5 at Ontario or at Ireland Park. There are another 7 of these statues at the Famine Memorial in Dublin, and that reduction of number is supposed to symbolize the loss of life. And of those who set out in 1847, to the New World from Ireland to North America, 1 in 6 didn't live to see the following year. So there was a huge loss of life. Perhaps a little more positive, though through equally terrible circumstances, is the story of Little Norway. So in 1940, Nazi Germany occupied Norway, and those who were serving abroad who managed to escape Norway, or Norwegians living elsewhere, like Norwegian Canadians, continued that war effort. And one way was through Camp Little Norway, which was set up at the Toronto Municipal Airport on now Billy Bishop, and was run by the Royal Norwegian Air Force. And these young Norwegian men were training there, preparing to eventually head back to Europe to liberate their homeland. And they really were sort of local celebrities at the time, which I find fascinating. There was a lot of maybe amusement around them. This image, which comes from the Toronto Star, the caption was something like, "Ooh, the men of Little Norway are enjoying a breakfast. Look like herrings on the menu." Ha ha ha. Like everyone's very intrigued by them. And 2 members who were serving Little Norway won a nearby skiing competition as well, which made the papers, although they changed their name to protect the identity and their families back home in Norway. And apparently one serviceman who was reflecting on his time at Camp Little Norway said that they would all go out on a Sunday to the gates of the camp, and there would be this long line of local Toronto ladies in their cars ready to take them all out on dates. So whether or not that's true, I don't know, but definitely that celebrity was there. Interestingly, in the beginning, before they were able to bring over planes owned by the Air Force, the Royal Norwegian Air Force, they actually used planes donated by the Toronto Flying Club. So a fascinating connection, but in a way, a similar use of the waterfront as a place of refuge. So now we're heading over to the Toronto Music Garden. And for those of you who've been, it's a very beautiful and I think unique space along the waterfront. It's one of a number of very unique spaces now where you get urban beaches, wilderness. There's many different offerings. This one, which was designed in part by the famous cellist Yo-Yo Ma, who actually performed along with members of Opera Atelier during its opening ceremony in 1999. It's inspired by Bach's first suite of unaccompanied cello, as well as different sections of the park represent different European folk music and dances from France, Germany, England, Spain, all of those, many different countries. You can see even in the pavilion here, the designer of the pavilion was told, do what you want with the design, there just can't be any straight lines. And you see that throughout the park. It's all meant to be sort of this whimsical location and a celebration of music. And what I find fascinating about this site and all of those different parks is it follows really a history of restricted access along the waterfront, beginning sort of, I think before then, but especially ramping up in the 1850s, when you have increased industrial development and you have the building of the railway, starting with the Great Northern Railway in 1852. And you got a ton of different railways, more and more developing until the end of that decade. There were plans in the early 1850s, one drafted by city planner John Howard, to have a promenade or I can't remember the name for it now, but a large walking space, an esplanade, that's the word I'm looking for, along the waterway that would have shrubs and walking spaces and space for pleasure drives to enjoy the lake. And although I know we have the esplanade neighborhood now, we never really had that leisure area that you could go around the waterfront. And you can see that buildup of industry, of rail, of shipping, all preventing people from accessing the water. I love the story into the I believe the 1960s. It was one commenter in the Toronto Star writing that he believed Torontonians had more familiarity with the backside of their moon than they did with their own lakefront. So it just goes to show how rare accessing it was. And by that time, of course, the Gardiner Expressway had also opened a separate barrier. But what I do find interesting is throughout that history of lack of access, that desire to use the water for fun still endured. These pictures are definitely a testament to it. Canoeing remained quite popular on the waterfront. This image taken at the Toronto Islands. And one sport that I find fantastic that I wasn't aware of before researching was ice boating. And you can see very clearly the boat here located on sort of skates or blades with the sail that you could glide along the ice. And they used to have pretty competitive ice boat races along the waterfront as well. What I find interesting about this photo is you still really see the industrial buildup in behind as well. And so, that industry is there, but you're still trying to find ways to access the water. I even know that, oddly enough, swimming remained popular into at least the late 1800s among a certain group of men who would go to a dock just south of Queen Street, a coal dock where coal was stored or shipped in and stored. But even though there was sort of that industry, it was cleaner. There was no raw sewage being dumped nearby, where there was in other parts of the harbor. So it was seen as a cleaner and a place to go for a dip on a hot day. I don't know if I would love to do that, but it shows the power, right, of the water and desire to utilize it. And as we continue on to Queen's Quay and sort of the Harbourfront Center area, again, really celebrating industry. In the image to the right here, you can see another silo, the Maple Leaf Mill silos, grain silos, from the 1920s. You have Canada Malting, we've touched on. Real buildup in the 1920s, you have the Tip Top Tailor Factory, the Loblaws Grosseteria, which just was recently redone, but which was a large warehouse and office space. You had jam manufacturing. Rogers Majestic was building radios on the waterfront. All of these different goods and factories that were created after what was called the 1912 Waterfront Plan, which was created by the Toronto Harbourfront Commission, which was formed only a year before. And that plan really was probably the most impactful thing to shape the waterfront. It called for land creation across the waterfront and really contributed to that extension further out into the lake to make room for industry. And I love the picture to the left by the Toronto Terminal Warehouse, which we'll talk about in a moment, really shows, of course, it's important to industry. You have shipping that is bringing the goods in, and then you have all of this rail that can immediately load it on and take those goods, distribute them to where they need to go. And the terminal warehouse itself, which you can see in this beautiful postcard from the 20s, is a real celebration and showing the industrial and commercial success of Toronto in the 1920s. It's a very confident city you're seeing here in that sort of Art Deco style of this warehouse, which was 8 floors. It had about a million square feet of storage space, including cold storage. And writers for Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, who visited the terminal warehouse when it opened in the late 20s, were just stunned by the goods that were coming from all over the world. You had peanuts from China, you had coffee from Sri Lanka, beef from Argentina, cod liver oil from Norway. I mean, all of these different things from every corner of the globe that could be stored there. There was a customs house. There was in the warehouse, there was a gallery room that you could show off goods to be sold. So a real bustling space. I think interestingly, and it sort of ties to Coronation Park in that not long after it opened, of course, we enter into the Great Depression. And in the winter of 1932 to 33, the garment manufacturers came together, about 400 different factories, and they actually gathered warm clothing, stored it in the warehouse and led the distribution of it there for people who needed the coats, jackets, sweaters, things like that to stay warm in the winter, those who were experiencing extreme poverty because of the Great Depression. So tying into that history as well. And then on the left, you can see sort of near the time of redevelopment in the 80s, the top right, very much how the terminal warehouse still looks today. It was actually Eberhard Zeidler again, who led the sort of adaptation and the reuse of that warehouse into a mixed use apartment, retail space. You also have a dance studio in there as well. And what I sort of love about the harbor area in general is if you think of the terminal warehouse as sort of connected to the world, we really still have that today through the Power Plant Art Gallery, through the Harborfront Center. You have all of these international talents and creativity now because of probably the beautiful backdrop and facilities of Toronto, which is quite a global city, coming in and utilizing that space to the benefit of Torontonians. And so we're going to continue on now to Sugar Beach and Sherburne Common, which again really show that contrast between industrial use and sort of the modern access and that sort of new take on how we can use the waterfront. Sugar Beach, of course, is in I guess you could say the shadow of the big Redpath sugar refinery. That plant is still in operation today. It opened in the late 1950s, anticipating the benefit of the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway, which would allow much more massive ships to enter into Toronto Harbor. And they were shipping in, I mean, huge amounts of sugar. I think a shipment before it opened in 1958 had about 2,500 or 2,500 tons of sugar. That's like 12,000 cars worth of sugar and weight that they were refining. And that was just one shipment. And what I love about Cherry Beach is sort of this celebration of the Redpath in a way, a nod to that industrial path. You have those bubblegum pink umbrellas. There are rocks as well throughout the beach that have red lines on them to celebrate, like to nod to candy canes. I even love the attention to detail to that beautiful warm white sand. And it actually took a while to find the right sand. And they wanted to find something that even when it's rainy and miserable and gloomy in Toronto, that sand stays bright and cheery. And it remains sort of this fun, enlivening space. And then when we move not far at all east to Sherburne Common, I mean, one thing I love about the area is that glass and metal. You have the George Brown campus newly opened nearby. You have the Chorus Entertainment Building, all of those apartments. I mean, if you think of the modern look of Ontario Place, although maybe not as space age, we see that really extending across the waterfront. And this park is really sort of a nod to a different relationship with nature, with the lake. This installation to the left, which is at the center of the park, is called Light Installations. It's by sculptor Jill Anholt. And actually way below the sculpture is a big UV water purification facility. It purifies storm water in a chemical-free way, and then that water flows up down through the fountain and then makes its way out to Lake Ontario. And I think it's such an interesting contrast because, of course, at Sherburne, you have the best vision possible of the massive Portland's industrial area that was built to the east of it. Here's a picture of the Portlands in the time, sort of by its completion to the left. And the Portlands actually rest on what was once that marsh we talked about way back at the beginning, Ashbridges Bay Marsh, about 1,200 acres of natural wetlands that, of course, was not valued at the time. And out in the wake of the 1912 plan, part of that plan was creating the Portlands area, using about 27 million square yards of land dredged up from the lake or shipped in to create a place for industry. And although the level of industry that was attracted there didn't reach the level that the harborfront had hoped for, especially heavy industry, there was still a lot of industrial activity. And then you had the big Hearn generation station built there. And I mean, that generator still dominates, although it's no longer in operation, it still dominates the Portlands. It's this massive building that at one time supplied about 10% of the electricity into Ontario's electrical grid. Until the 70s, it ran purely on coal and spewed out about 80 million tons of sulfur dioxide a year. So all of that pollution coming from this building. You also had nearby the Ashbridges Bay wastewater treatment, which until the 90s was burning, in part burning dried sewage. The fumes from that, a study was done in the 90s and it showed that actually asthma levels were higher in the east end of Toronto as a result of that facility. And one last story about sort of the environmental pollution, especially in the mid-1900s, is in the late 50s. In 58, you had the visit of Princess Margaret. And the city planners were worried because she'd have to pass over the Don River, which was highly polluted at the time. And so there were rumors that city officials dumped perfume into the river to sort of make it smell nicer for Princess Margaret. And I believe, and this story actually comes from the historian Jennifer Bunnell, but I believe they actually used, might have used, what's it called, lime around the edges of the water to mitigate that smell when she visited. And actually they held a funeral service for the Don in 1969, local citizens who the Don was just so polluted, and that was all flowing out into the lake. So, you know, that contrast between, what Sherburne Common represents is quite interesting. And then I just want to very quickly touch on the image to the right, which I find fascinating, because again, we're talking about access to the lake and this into the 70s, right? Whereas today, if you go south on Sherburne's, you're greeted by this park, Sherburne Common, you can see all of the obstacles, right? You see a highway, you see rail car, parking lot, industry, maybe a warehouse, right? You see the shipping, right? It's all of these different barriers to the lake that we're overcoming now. Our next stop, Cherry Beach, sort of ties to that history of the Portlands. They developed it in stages. So about half of the Portlands, I would say, was completed by the time of the First World War. And there's actually some production around arms for the First World War that happened on the Portland site. And then in the 30s, it extended all the way to what is now Cherry Beach. And that strip of sand that is Cherry Beach used to be part of what was called Fisherman's Island, a very small island that fishermen would boat to. So you have this strip of sand, this beach area. You didn't have, obviously, the industrial development in the Portland that was hoped for. So there was this free space. And I believe in the 1930s, it was Alderman Harry Clark who arranged busing with the TTC, arranged what they called bathing carts to bring people on weekends down through the Portlands area to Cherry Beach to enjoy a day at the beach. Really important, I know into the 1950s, people who couldn't afford the ferry ride, say, to the Toronto Island, at least had this spot that they could bring their family to. The beach is actually named Clark Beach, although the name Cherry Beach has stuck. I apologize, I actually don't know. I've looked where the name Cherry Beach came from, although I think it's a very alluring, kind of beautiful name, so I understand why it's stuck. What I find interesting about Cherry Beach is it really is a place of contrast and sort of an unexpected place in that you have a beach area at the foot of this massive industrial space, and even today, although a lot of it's now due to the construction they're doing to recreate the space, and I'll talk about that momentarily. You're going through all of this industry, and it's almost like this oasis that opens up. There's also a lot of bush and trees at its back that separate it. So you also have sort of a darker history with the area as well. You have a history of petty crime. In the 1950s, one reporter called the area a sin hotbed and a crime wilderness. There was public dumping, and there was quite a bit of pollution, I know, into the 1960s there. And you had more violent crime as well. You had assaults. There were 2 murders that apparently happened in the area in 1956, one of Linda Lampkin and Gary Morris. So it is really a place of, I think, contrast and a very complex location that I'm just fascinated by. The image on the right is one of a few bridges that have been brought in that aren't open yet, I don't believe, but will add more connection between sort of the mainland, passing over the Keating Channel at the entrance to the Portlands, over into the Portlands themselves. They're recreating the Portlands to make it more of a mixed-use neighborhood with lots of natural space. That's an ongoing development, but I suspect once that's completed, it will further reduce sort of the isolation of Cherry Beach, which I think has already been reduced through bike access and just the growth of the city and growing demand for natural spaces. And so the last stop we're touching on today is Thompson Park. And what an interesting sort of place to, again, look at that different relationship between Torontonians and natural spaces. And of course, to the left is another picture of the Ashbridges Bay Marsh, which was seen as a very filthy, unhealthy place, something that needed to be eradicated for a growing city. There might have been some logic to this. Of course, there was the theory of foul air for a long time, and that idea of foul air being tied to disease. And in a way, the mosquito populations that did spread malaria in the 1800s from the marsh sort of validated that to the people of the time. And of course, the harbor, as Toronto grew, became more and more polluted. Changes to the harbor as well meant that there wasn't the same flow of water through the marshland, which meant that industrial pollution, the raw sewage that was being dumped into the harbor, that really got caught up and stagnated in the marsh area. And actually, it was the Keating Channel built at the end of the 1900s. And again, I'll just show you on the map there. That's that when you enter in the Portlands, on Cherry Street, it's that first strip, sort of the mouth of the Don River, and it was redirected to flow some water through there to sort of clean the area up a bit, but it was seen as something that needed to be overcome, and of course in the creation of the Portlands it was. And what a contrast to Thompson Park, which is this large natural space that is largely a natural space now due to campaigning of Torontonians, especially sort of in the mid to 1900s, the 1970s. And so the actual Leslie Street Spit, as it used to be called, was built out by the Harbourfront Commission sort of in the anticipation of the St. Lawrence Seaway opening, which I'd mentioned earlier, tying into Redpath Sugar. And they thought maybe this would be an area where more port facilities could be built. It would act as a breakwater to sort of protect against the rougher Lake Ontario waters as well. But even as it was being built, and we started in the 1960s and we continued into the 90s, it became clear that there wouldn't be the demand and the need for that use. And I think likely just through a natural sort of reclamation of the land by nature, and opening up of the spit to people to bike and walk. There was a desire to keep it as a natural space. That wasn't a guarantee. There were plans to turn it into an airport or an amusement park-like area, maybe similar to Ontario Place in the 70s. But eventually those campaigning to keep it a natural space won out. And it's so interesting thinking the impact we can have both for the negative and for the positive. That impact that we've had on the waterfront really goes back very early. I mean, before even the heavy industrial buildup, you know, when you're thinking of like more maybe rural and what we might consider idyllic industries like the mills that you might see at a place like Black Creek Pioneer Village, right? Lumber mills, sawmill, grain mills, tanneries. Even those had a harmful impact. I mean, the sawmills themselves, the dust coming from them killed insect populations, which took away food for salmon populations, harming them and eventually leading to the extinction of that, with some other impacts leading to the extinction of local salmon populations. Whereas now we can also have that impact for the better. Interestingly, sort of the ban on DDT pesticide in the 90s led to this resurgence of cormorant populations. And the cormorant birds' nesting practices are, it sounds bad, but it's actually, so they're harmful to the trees in places like Tommy Thompson. They actually kill a lot of the trees, but what that does is that it frees up natural grass space for ring-billed gulls, and the ring-billed gull population has exploded, and that's food for coyotes. So a coyote population has grown there. So these ecosystems that have come back, as well as through direct kind of tailoring of the landscape. The land is managed by the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. And although it looks like a natural space, they're actively creating habitats for fish, plants, and other wildlife, which has allowed those local populations of animals and plants to really thrive in the area. One last thing I want to mention about Tommy Thompson that I find quite fascinating is it really is like this timeline of history. In that all the land you're standing on, for the most part, a lot of it is rubble that ties to Toronto's development. Two local researchers, and I apologize, I don't have their name, but if you go on our digital tour, I have mentioned them there because they deserve the credit, because they were instrumental in analyzing the debris of Tommy Thompson and looking at, for example, in one section closer to the mainland, in that long spit, which juts out very far into the lake, they tied it to development in the 1960s. They found bricks and they found household implements like wires from glasses and medicine bottles and toothpaste tubes, all of those things that they tied to the sort of demolition of row houses, 19th century row houses downtown in places like Alexandra Park in Toronto. And then that rubble was brought to create the land that now makes up Tommy Thompson and made way for new, sort of the modernization of the Toronto downtown that started in the 1960s. Further on, you have bricks that they've tied to buildings and tied to development from the 1980s and the building of those massive skyscrapers downtown. There's been ties to the subway development and digging out space for subway tunnels. And so all of that history is located at Tommy Thompson. And I kind of find it fascinating. You know, a lot of those bricks are tied to the area, such as the Brickworks, Evergreen Brickworks area in the Don River Valley. And so you get this sort of, from nature, this material built up into buildings and then returning to nature again at Tommy Thompson Park. And I think it's this fantastic circular story. So with that, I'd really like to thank you for joining me on this tour across the waterfront. I encourage you to take the time, either walking or biking, to explore it on your own and to enjoy the access that we now have to this space that wasn't always the case and has undergone so much development and really shaped as a city. So again, thank you so much. I think we're going to jump into question and answer right as well, so please stick around.
That is absolutely amazing, Stephen. I think I've learned so much today. I'm looking at a few of these questions, things that I'm just going to get into. It's just fantastic presentation. I have to just say, just Tommy Thompson Park, I spent a lot of time personally just down there, cycling and walking. When you speak about the bricks and just the contribution, I don't know, when people go down there to see now there's sculptures of people have been taking some of the bricks and building things with the rebar and doing lots of their own sort of personal expressions on the lakefront. But it is such a wilderness haven, as you point out, but just how this space has sort of grown along. So I'm just, again, just great. And so many of the things that you brought forward have been great. We want to open it up. So I want to thank you on behalf of Aaron, just a really terrific presentation, learned so much. We want to open it up to the floor of any questions and answers. If you can sort of type those into the Q&A feature, which is on the bottom of Zoom. If you have specifics, I know there's a few that are coming up, and can sort of field some of those to Stephen. Just taking a little moment just to sort of see them. So I'll start right at the beginning, if that's okay, Stephen. Just to Edith has asked a question where she said she knows about the peddling of the waterfront, and she said she's involved with the Northwest Cultural Trail that Al Rozowski at the city is involved in. She's just curious if Heritage Toronto is working with the city on this amazing trail, which will be full of natural and cultural heritage, including First Nations. And just wondering if you know of, I mean, is that something?
I myself don't know of any project around that currently, but I think we're always looking for opportunities to develop tours. And I think a lot of seasons now include a cycling tour, because of course those trails have extended so much. So that's a fantastic note. Maybe I'll go through and jot that down too, because it sounds like a wonderful space. I mean, I think it's amazing that we live in a city that, you know, you can have that connection to so many green spaces through the cycle paths. And I mean, you could do a whole tour on the Don River Valley as well. So much research has been done there and beyond. So I don't believe right now that I'm aware of there's one specifically, but I think it's a fantastic suggestion.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's wonderful. Another question that's come up is questions just on the music garden. Do you know if there's actual music performances that take place at the Toronto Music Garden, the one that you cited?
Yeah, definitely. I know there are. I believe, I apologize that I don't know where you'd find the schedule for that. It would probably be worth a Google. But yes, it is, and that pavilion is set up as well as a bit of an amphitheater space or theater space for musical performances. And I know that typically they're held throughout the year. I don't know this year, but I know that there are performances in the past. I haven't been able to attend one yet, but I think it would be a beautiful venue too, for sure.
In the future, as we're all living in the future.
Totally.
Another question, just on maybe the leisure activity, which has come up. Heather's asked, could you say that the building of the industry along Toronto's waterfront in the first half of the 20th century impacted how much of the waterfront could be used for leisure activity? Was there sort of a second part? She's asking if did recreation along Toronto's waterfront become more restricted?
Yeah, it definitely did. And it's interesting. I mean, it's one of those things that commerce and industry takes priority, whether or not, I think there were definitely different camps, right? There were groups who really wanted to develop it for industry and others who really wanted to preserve it as a space people could access. You do, even in the height of industry, have those spaces like Sunnyside Amusement, like the Toronto Islands, that are outside of sort of the central waterfront that you can go to and enjoy the lake a bit. But when we're talking industrial development, we're especially talking about that central waterfront, sort of by the Portlands out to where Ontario Place is now, and a little bit beyond. It's interesting, and I didn't mention in the tour, but in the 1912 plan that which I mentioned a few times, there actually was a lot of green space built in. In fact, the southern tip of the Portlands was built to be a place for like cottages. So we're going to have an artificial lagoon and walkways. And later, the chief engineer for that commission admitted that a lot of that was sort of a marketing tactic to build public support because it was such a massive project that they were proposing. So it really is a story where industry took precedent, continued to build along the waterfront. And it isn't until I believe the 1960s where there's rumblings of let's start to address that. And I don't think it was all completely altruistic because, of course, at that time, highways are becoming so much more important to industry, and industry is moving outside of city centers because highways and trucking are a more important maybe form of transportation than ship and train. So that's when you start to see that sort of maybe the receding of industry along the waterfront.
Interesting. Now I had written, I was really curious about, you mentioned about Little Norway and the Ireland part. And there's a question, just going to throw about Stadium Road and the ball club that Toronto had there. Do you know anything sort of further along that territory? I know a little bit. I kind of but not much. And I just, just out of general question, do you know any more?
No, I'm sorry. It didn't come up in my research. Would that have been located where those parks are roughly?
So right where Stadium Road is listed and where the Tip Top Tailors is, and it's not a park, where there's now the allocation of like Little Norway and the parks there. There was a massive ball club for the Toronto Maple Leafs. There was an actual stadium. I'm not sure when it was built, but it was poured down in the early 60s for housing there.
Yes.
And I can't remember if then the Toronto Maple Leafs, I think that was the name of the ball club. I don't know if that went up to Christie Pitts, but the ball club was there. It was a recreation. I mean, it was definitely an area. I just personally only know it because my father was a member of a yacht club down in that area. So there was quite a bit of activity sort of going on, but I just wondered if you knew of any.
Sorry.
No, that was just my question.
I do recall, now that you say it, a stadium-like area, so it must be the ball club, coming in early 1900s in the images of the archival images. So there was a space there. And I think it probably goes to, I know it was nearby in industry such as the malting company silos. Yes. So I think it does go where when you're getting to the edge of heavy industry, you're getting a few more like Sunnyside Amusement Park, you're getting that stadium, and Coronation Park, which was relatively early, again, 1930s, so before the real recession of industry. So there, I think, especially in the West End, there was a bit more recreation happening.
Yeah, and I'm just, it's interestingly enough, I just looking at the chat right here, somebody has written about Maple Leaf. It was called Maple Leaf Baseball Stadium. Yeah. And one of the owners was Percy Gardner, who Edith has mentioned had a country estate in her hood. So
wonderful.
The things, again, you brought so much forward to on this presentation, things I think many of us just don't know about, but it's just, this is great. And I'm just looking if there's any other questions, whether they come up live or through chat, just to look at. But this is wonderful. Really, 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 really so helpful to know. Yeah, it's this is great. Rivermead, Edith has mentioned that this is the standing house. She says, inviting, come and see it, come and check it out.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Edith. This is wonderful.
Great. So I think what we're going to do is we're just going to try to wrap this up. I think just looking for any further questions, both right now. I think just to, if you have any sort of further things, do feel free to reach out to Heritage to Heritage Toronto at the info@heritagetoronto.org. I want to just thank, again, I want to thank Steven for this presentation. I want to also thank our 2021 presenting sponsor TD, as well as Andrew and Sharon Himmel and the Himmel family for making this whole tour possible. It's been just fantastic. If you have enjoyed this tour, please do check out some of our other great tours that we're offering this season, both virtually and in person. And the details can be found under our Heritage Toronto website under What's On. And if you're also interested, because we are a donor-driven charity, over the past year, our donor support has allowed us to continue serving Toronto by prioritizing emerging historian opportunities, developing new tours, and expanding our digital programming. So if you believe in the importance of engaging with both our past and sharing our passion of Toronto, please take action and please join our circle of donors and renew your support today. And again, I just want to thank everybody for coming out today. It's been great. And I want to say goodbye. Thank you. Thanks one and all.